"You're not on the list. There must be a mistake." Those were the words my wife of 19 years said to me in front of 200 guests at the entrance to a vineyard in Middleburg, Virginia, on the day her daughter got married. I had paid for that wedding. Every flower, every chair, every bottle of champagne sweating in its silver bucket. I had walked that girl through her algebra homework when she was 11 and sat in the front row at her college graduation when her biological father didn't show. And now Camille Whitfield, my wife, was standing between me and a tent full of white roses, her hand flat against my chest like I was a stranger trying to crash a party I'd funded. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, said, "It's okay," and walked back to my car. By the time I reached my house in Great Falls, I had already called my lawyer. By the next afternoon, Camille Whitfield and her daughter were going to learn exactly what kind of mistake they had made. My name is Whitfield Calloway, and this is the story of how the woman I loved for 19 years tried to erase me from a life I built, on the one day she thought I'd be too heartbroken to fight back. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 26 years as an estate planning attorney in Alexandria, Virginia. My office sits 2 blocks from the King Street waterfront, in a converted townhouse with exposed brick and the kind of quiet that makes clients trust you with their secrets. I help people decide who gets what when they die. I draft trusts. I structure inheritances. I negotiate the peace between siblings who haven't spoken in a decade, but suddenly need to agree on who gets the lake house. It's not glamorous work, but it taught me something most people never learn until it's too late. The documents matter more than the promises. People will tell you they love you forever. Paper tells you the truth. I met Camille at a fundraising gala for the Alexandria Symphony 14 years ago. She was 40 then, recently divorced, raising a 9-year-old daughter named Brielle on a part-time interior design income and a child support check that arrived late more often than not. She wore a navy dress that night, simple, no jewelry except small gold studs. And when she laughed at something the man next to her said, it carried across the room in a way that made me forget I was supposed to be making small talk with a donor. I introduced myself during the silent auction. She told me later that she almost didn't come that night, that she'd argued with herself in the car about whether it was worth the babysitter money. I've thought about that a lot since the wedding. How close I came to never meeting her at all, and how much easier my life would be now if I hadn't. We dated for 2 years before I asked her to marry me. I was deliberate about it, the way I'm deliberate about everything. I wanted to know Brielle first, wanted to see how Camille was as a mother before I decided how I wanted to be as a husband. Brielle was 11 when I started showing up to her soccer games on Saturday mornings, sitting in a folding chair next to Camille, learning the names of her teammates, learning that she liked grape Gatorade and hated when people called her Brie. She was a serious kid, quiet in a way that made you want to earn her trust rather than assume it. It took almost a year before she'd let me help her with homework. It took 2 before she called me anything other than Whitfield. The first time she called me Dad, she was 13, and it was an accident, a slip in the middle of asking if she could stay at a friend's house. She caught herself, went red, and said, "I mean Whitfield." I told her it was fine either way. I never pushed it after that. I let her get there on her own. Camille and I married in a small ceremony at a chapel in Middleburg when Brielle was 12. Brielle stood beside her mother as a junior bridesmaid in a pale green dress, and during the reception she gave a toast that she'd clearly practiced and clearly hadn't expected to cry through. She said I was the first person who ever showed up to things without being asked twice. I kept that piece of paper, the index card with her handwriting on it, in the top drawer of my desk at the office for 19 years. I still have it. I looked at it the morning after the wedding I wasn't allowed to attend. For the next decade and a half, I built a life with these 2 women that I believed, with the kind of certainty a man only has about things he's never had reason to question, was permanent. I paid for Brielle's braces, her car insurance, her semester abroad in Florence, that her biological father, a man named Roy Pruitt who drifted in and out of her life like weather, never once contributed $1 toward. When Brielle got into George Washington University, I sat with her at the kitchen table going over the financial aid forms, and when the aid wasn't enough, I quietly transferred the difference from an account she never knew existed. I walked her down a hallway, not an aisle, on the day she defended her senior thesis, because her mother had a client meeting and Roy didn't answer his phone. I was at every milestone that mattered. I was there for the ones that didn't matter too, because that's what you do when you decide a child is yours, regardless of what biology says about it. Camille's career flourished during those years in a way I was genuinely proud of. She went from doing small residential design jobs to running her own firm, Callaway Interiors, with a client list that eventually included 2 sitting members of Congress and a Saudi diplomat's wife. I helped her structure the LLC. I reviewed every contract before she signed it. I sat through 3 years of slow, unglamorous growth with her. The years where she was driving to job sites in a 10-year-old Volvo and eating gas station coffee for breakfast. Before the years where she was driving a leased Mercedes and being photographed for a feature in a regional design magazine. I tell you all of this not to keep score, though I understand how it sounds. I tell you because I need you to understand what 19 years of building something looks like, before I tell you how quickly it can be taken apart by 2 women standing at a tent entrance with a clipboard. The cracks started showing about 18 months before the wedding, though I didn't recognize them as cracks at the time. I recognized them as exhaustion, as the natural friction of 2 people who'd been married long enough to stop performing for each other. Camille started taking calls in her home office with the door closed, something she'd never done before. She started going to client dinners that ran later than client dinners usually run, coming home at 10 or 11 smelling faintly of wine and somebody else's cologne, which she explained away as the restaurant, as the other guests, as nothing. I noticed the way you notice a draft in a house you've lived in for years, without immediately understanding where it's coming from. The man's name, I would later learn, was Desmond Achibi Hartley, a venture capitalist she'd met through a client referral, 12 years younger than her, the kind of man who wore a blazer to a Tuesday lunch and called it casual. I found out about him the way I find out about everything, methodically, and without telling anyone what I was doing until I had the full picture. A man doesn't spend 26 years drafting documents that anticipate every possible way a family can fracture without learning how to read the early signs of one fracturing in his own house. But here's the thing about that wedding day that I need you to understand before I go further. I didn't yet know about Desmond when I drove out to that vineyard in Middleburg. I suspected something was wrong in my marriage. I did not suspect that the wrongness had metastasized into something that would have my own wife physically blocking me from the entrance to my stepdaughter's wedding, in front of 200 people, with my name conspicuously absent from a guest list I had paid $41,000 to fund. Brielle was 26 when she got engaged to a man named Theo Whitlock, a structural engineer she'd met at a mutual friend's barbecue in Arlington. I liked Theo immediately. He had the kind of quiet competence that reminded me of myself at that age, the sense that he'd rather be useful than impressive. When they got engaged, Brielle called me before she called her mother. I remember exactly where I was standing in my kitchen when my phone rang and her name came up on the screen. "Whitfield," she said, and I could hear that she was crying, the good kind of crying. "I wanted you to be the first to know. Theo asked me last night." I had to sit down. 26 years old, and she still called me before she called her own mother with news like that. I told her I was proud of her, that Theo was a lucky man, and that whatever the wedding cost, I wanted to be the one who paid for it. She tried to argue. I didn't let her. That conversation happened 14 months before the wedding. Somewhere in those 14 months, something shifted, and I'll admit to you now, the way I couldn't admit to myself then, that I didn't see it shifting in real time. I was busy. I had 3 estate disputes going to mediation that spring, a partner at my firm who was retiring and needed his succession plan finalized, and a wife who I now understand was actively constructing a version of events in which I was becoming, slowly and deliberately, less and less necessary to the narrative of her daughter's wedding. It started small. I wasn't included in the menu tasting, which Camille explained as an oversight. The planner had only booked 4 seats, and she'd assumed I wouldn't want to sit through 2 hours of comparing salmon preparations anyway. I let that go. I wasn't included in the conversation about the seating chart, though I noticed when I glanced at a draft Camille left open on the kitchen island one evening that my name wasn't on it at all, not even at a back table. When I asked her about it, she said the chart was still in progress, that of course I'd be seated, don't be paranoid, Whitfield. I let that go too, because that's what 19 years of trust does to a man. It makes him slow to believe the evidence in front of him. The dress rehearsal happened the Thursday before the wedding, at the same vineyard where the ceremony would take place 2 days later, a property called Ashbourne Hill, set back from a 2-lane road outside Middleburg, with a converted dairy barn that had been turned into an event space, all exposed beams and string lights. I wasn't invited to the rehearsal dinner either. Camille told me it was being kept small, immediate family and the wedding party only, and that I should plan to arrive directly at the ceremony on Saturday. I want to be honest with you. By that point, some quiet, unspoken part of me had already started to understand what was happening. I just hadn't let myself say the words out loud yet, even inside my own head. A man can know something and refuse to know it at the same time. I had become very good at that particular skill over the previous 18 months. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that Brielle had nothing to do with any of this. My stepdaughter, the girl who'd given a tearful toast at our wedding when she was 12 years old, had spent the better part of a year being lied to by her own mother about a guest list that Camille had quietly, deliberately edited behind the scenes. Camille had told Brielle that I was uncomfortable attending, that I'd had a falling out with her that I was too embarrassed to discuss, that it would be easier on everyone if my presence wasn't forced into a day that should be about Brielle and Theo. Brielle, swamped with her own wedding stress and trusting her mother the way daughters generally do, hadn't thought to call and ask me directly. She assumed, because her mother had given her every reason to assume, that there was a private adult conflict she wasn't meant to wade into. I drove to Middleburg on Saturday morning with a card in my breast pocket that I'd spent 3 nights writing and rewriting, and a check inside it, a wedding gift on top of everything else I'd already paid for, because that's who I am, even when something in my gut is telling me to be cautious. I wore the navy suit Camille had picked out for me 8 months earlier, when we'd still been speaking to each other like people who shared a life. I parked in the gravel overflow lot because the main lot was already full, and I walked toward the dairy barn entrance where a young woman in a black dress stood with an iPad, checking names against a digital list. "Calloway," I told her. "Whitfield Calloway." She scrolled. She scrolled again. She looked up at me with the particular discomfort of someone who has just realized they're about to deliver bad news to a man in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent. "I'm so sorry, sir. I don't have you on here. Let me just..." And that's when Camille appeared, stepping out from behind a cluster of white hydrangeas like she'd been waiting for this exact moment, like she'd positioned herself there on purpose. She was wearing a champagne-colored gown, mother of the bride elegant, her hair professionally curled, and for 1/2 of 1 second, I saw something cross her face that might have been guilt, before it hardened into something else. "Whitfield." Her voice was pitched for an audience, loud enough that the cluster of guests waiting behind me went quiet. "You're not on the list. There must be a mistake." She put her hand flat against my chest, not shoving me, just enough pressure to make the gesture unmistakable to everyone watching. 200 people. People I had hosted in my own home, people whose children I had drafted college funds for, people who had eaten dinner at my table more times than I could count, watched my wife of 19 years deny me entry to an event I had paid $41,000 to make possible. I want you to understand something about who I am, because it matters for what happens next. I am not a man who raises his voice in public. I have spent 26 years in rooms where families are tearing each other apart over money, and I learned a long time ago that the person who stays calm is always the person who walks out of that room holding the advantage. So I looked at Camille and I said, "It's okay." 2 words. I turned around. I walked back through the gravel lot, past guests who were now openly staring, past a valet who wouldn't meet my eyes, and I got into my car. I sat there for exactly 4 minutes before I started the engine. I know it was 4 minutes because I looked at the clock when I parked, and I looked at it again before I pulled out, And in between those 4 minutes, something in me went very, very quiet. Not sad quiet, calculating quiet. The same quiet I get in a conference room when a client tells me their sibling just tried to forge a signature on a trust amendment. I drove the 50 minutes back to Great Falls without turning on the radio. Here is what almost nobody at that wedding understood. What Camille herself had apparently forgotten in whatever fog of justification she'd built around her own behavior over the preceding 18 months. I am an estate planning attorney who has spent over 2.5 decades structuring exactly the kind of financial architecture that determines what happens to a marriage, a business, and an inheritance when trust collapses. I don't get angry in the way other men get angry. I get precise. The moment I walked into my home office that afternoon, still in my navy suit, I didn't pour a drink. I didn't sit in the dark feeling sorry for myself, though God knows I had every reason to. I opened my laptop and I called a man named Garrison Okafor Reyes, who had been my closest friend since law school at the University of Virginia, and who now ran one of the most respected family law practices in Fairfax County. Garrison and I had played golf together every other Sunday for almost 20 years. He had been there, sitting 2 tables over, at my wedding to Camille. He picked up on the second ring. "Garrison, it's Whitfield. I need you to clear your morning tomorrow." "What happened?" I told him. All of it, in the flat, organized way I tell clients the facts of their own cases, because that's the only way I knew how to get through it without my voice breaking. He was silent for a long moment after I finished. "Whitfield," he finally said, "I've known Camille for almost as long as I've known you. I need you to be sure before we do anything that can't be undone." "I've never been more sure of anything," I told him. "She didn't make a mistake tonight, Garrison. She made a decision. The mistake was thinking I wouldn't notice it was deliberate." What Camille did not know, what almost nobody in that family knew, was the actual structure of our finances. 19 years earlier, before we married, I had insisted, gently but firmly, on a prenuptial agreement, not because I doubted Camille, but because I had watched too many marriages collapse in my office to ever walk into one unprotected, regardless of how much I loved someone. Camille had agreed to it without much resistance at the time. She had very little to bring into the marriage financially, and the agreement, drafted by Garrison's predecessor at the firm, protected the assets I brought in, including a Great Falls property that had been in my family for 2 generations, and a substantial investment portfolio that had been growing, quietly and steadily, for the better part of 3 decades. But here is the detail that mattered most, the one Camille had either forgotten or never fully understood the implications of. When Callaway Interiors had needed startup capital 12 years ago, the initial loan, $240,000, had come not from a bank, but from me, structured as a personal loan from my own premarital assets, with the LLC itself drafted under terms that gave me a contractual security interest in the company until the loan was repaid in full. Camille had paid back perhaps $60,000 of that over the years, in irregular installments. The rest quietly rolled into the broader structure of our shared finances in a way that, on paper, had never actually been resolved. She had built an extremely successful design firm, the kind of firm that was now regularly featured in regional publications, on a foundation that I, on paper, still had a documented legal claim to. She had simply never thought about it again once the business started thriving. I had thought about it every single year, the way I think about every document I've ever drafted, because that is the entire discipline of my profession. I also knew something else Camille didn't know I knew. 3 weeks before the wedding, I had quietly hired a private investigator, a meticulous, soft-spoken woman named Priscilla Vandermeer, who had done discreet work for several of my clients over the years, to confirm what my gut had been telling me about Desmond Achebe Hartley. The report had arrived on a Tuesday, 2 days before the rehearsal dinner I wasn't invited to. It contained, among other things, hotel records from a property in Georgetown, dated across 11 months, and several photographs that I had looked at exactly once, with the same controlled professional detachment I bring to looking at evidence in any case, before locking the folder in my office safe and deciding I would address it on my own timeline, not Camille's. So when Garrison arrived at my house at 8 o'clock the next morning, the Sunday after the wedding, with a leather folder under his arm and the particular grim focus of a man who has spent a sleepless night drafting documents. We were not starting from zero. We were finishing something I had already, without fully admitting it to myself, begun building months earlier. "Walk me through exactly what you want to happen," Garrison said, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Brielle with her financial aid forms 8 years earlier. "I want the security interest on Callaway Interiors formally and immediately enforced," I said. "I want a formal demand letter for the outstanding loan balance, full amount, due within 30 days, exactly as the original agreement specifies. I want the divorce filing drafted, citing the prenuptial agreement in full, and I want Desmond Achebe Hartley's name and the Georgetown Hotel records attached as supporting documentation for the infidelity clause, which, as you'll remember, significantly affects the spousal support provisions we wrote into that agreement 19 years ago." I paused. "And I want all of it delivered tomorrow morning. Not because I'm trying to ruin her, Garrison. Because I am done being patient with people who think my patience is the same thing as weakness." Garrison studied me for a long moment. "And Brielle?" That question landed harder than anything else he could have said. "Brielle didn't do this," I told him. "I need you to understand that clearly before we go any further. Whatever happens with Camille, Brielle is still my daughter, and nothing about what's happening tomorrow should touch her directly. I'll handle that conversation myself." The documents went out Monday morning, hand-delivered by a process server to Camille's office on King Street, the same street my own office sits on, 2 blocks away, a detail I noted with a kind of bitter irony I didn't examine too closely. The demand letter for the Callaway Interiors loan balance was delivered simultaneously to the registered agent of the LLC. The divorce filing, with its attached documentation, was delivered to our home in Great Falls that same afternoon, while I was at the office handling, with what I can only describe as surreal calm, a routine trust signing for an elderly client and her grandson. My phone started ringing at 2:14 that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again at 2:19 and 2:31 and 2:47. By 4 o'clock there were 11 missed calls from Camille and 3 from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out, I would later learn, to be Desmond's. I didn't answer any of them. I drove home at my normal time, ate dinner alone at that same kitchen table, and went to bed. Camille was waiting in the driveway when I got home from the office the next evening, sitting on the front steps in the November cold without a coat, which struck me even then as a kind of performance, the way everything about that wedding day had been a performance for an audience of 200. I parked and got out of my car slowly. "You're trying to destroy me," she said before I'd even reached the steps. Her voice was raw in a way I hadn't heard in years. $240,000, Whitfield. You want me to liquidate my company over a debt from 12 years ago that we both agreed didn't matter anymore? "We never agreed it didn't matter," I said, keeping my voice level. "You stopped paying it down, and I stopped reminding you, because I trusted that whatever we had was bigger than a spreadsheet. I was wrong about that, apparently. So now we're back to the spreadsheet." "This is about the wedding," she said. "This is you punishing me because I made one bad call at the entrance. Camille." I stopped on the second step, close enough now that I could see her makeup had run, that whatever composure she'd worn like armor for the past year and a half had finally cracked. "I know about Desmond." The silence that followed lasted long enough that a neighbor's dog started barking somewhere down the street, and I watched it register on her face, the specific, total collapse of someone who has just understood that the version of events they'd been managing for months has come completely apart at once. "I can explain that," she finally said, "which is, I have learned over 26 years in this profession what people say exactly when there is nothing left to explain." "I don't need you to," I told her. "I needed you to keep me on a guest list at a wedding I paid for. You couldn't manage that. So now I don't need anything else from you either." I called my stepdaughter the following Sunday, 6 days after her wedding, and asked if she would meet me for coffee, just the 2 of us, at a place in Old Town Alexandria we used to go to when she was in college and needed someone to vent to who wasn't her mother. She showed up in jeans and an oversized sweater, looking exhausted in the specific way new brides look exhausted, and the moment she sat down across from me, she started crying before either of us had said a word. "Whitfield," "I didn't know," she said. "I swear to God I didn't know any of it. Mom told me you didn't want to come, that you two had some falling out you didn't want to talk about. I should have called you. I should have just called you instead of believing her." I reached across the small marble table and took her hand, the same way I had years earlier when she was 11 and crying over a math test she'd failed. "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her. "You trusted your mother, the way a daughter should be able to. None of this is on you, and I need you to actually hear that, not just nod and pretend to hear it." "What's going to happen now?" she asked. "With you and Mom?" I was honest with her, the way I've always tried to be honest with her, even when honesty was inconvenient. "Your mother and I are getting divorced," I said. "There are some financial matters between us that are going to be difficult, and I won't pretend otherwise. But Brielle, listen to me carefully. None of that changes what you and I are to each other. I am still your father, in every way that has ever mattered, and that's not something a wedding seating chart can undo." She cried harder at that, the relieved kind of crying, and I sat with her in that coffee shop for almost 2 hours while she told me everything. The version of the wedding planning Camille had constructed, the lies layered carefully enough that even a daughter who loved me couldn't see through them in time. Theo joined us toward the end, having been texted by Brielle sometime in the second hour, and he shook my hand and told me, with the kind of directness I'd liked about him from the start, that he was sorry, that he hadn't known either, that I would always have a seat at any table he and Brielle ever set. The following months unfolded with the particular slow grind that anyone who has been through a contested divorce will recognize. Camille hired her own attorney, a sharp, aggressive woman from a firm in Tyson's Corner, who tried in the opening rounds to argue that the prenuptial agreement should be invalidated on the grounds that it was unconscionable, a familiar tactic I had seen deployed against dozens of clients over the years, and had, frankly, anticipated. Garrison dismantled that argument in a single afternoon of depositions, walking the court through 19 years of financial records, the original loan documentation for Callaway Interiors, and Camille's own signature, notarized and witnessed, on the original agreement. The business loan was the part that hurt her the most, I think, more than the divorce itself, more even than the affair becoming a matter of court record. Callaway Interiors, the firm she had built from nothing, the firm with the congressional clients and the magazine features, was forced into a structured repayment plan that required her to liquidate a significant portion of her ownership stake to a private buyer, a competitor firm in McLean that had been trying to acquire her client list for years, and now got the opportunity at a depressed valuation, all because the outstanding loan, plus 19 years of accrued interest under the terms she herself had signed, came due all at once. I want to be honest with you. There was a part of me, in those early months, that took a grim satisfaction in watching the structure I'd built years earlier do exactly what it was designed to do. I'm not proud of that part of myself. I'm also not going to pretend it wasn't there. Desmond Achebe Hartley, for his part, disappeared from Camille's life with a speed that told me everything about the nature of what they'd actually had. He was, it turned out, in the process of raising a new venture fund, and had no interest in being publicly associated with a messy, well-documented divorce that named him explicitly in court filings. He stopped returning her calls within 3 weeks of the documents going public. Camille, I later heard through the small, gossiping network of mutual acquaintances that exists in any tight social circle, spent that Christmas alone in a rental apartment in Falls Church, the Great Falls house having gone to me under the terms of the prenup, while her company restructured around her, and the man she'd risked everything for evaporated the moment the relationship became inconvenient. I'm not going to tell you I felt nothing watching all of this unfold. I felt something. But it wasn't joy exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when a structure you designed to hold weight finally gets tested and doesn't buckle. Vindication, maybe, but a quiet, exhausted kind. Brielle and Theo, meanwhile, became a fixed part of my life in a way that, if I'm honest, mattered more to me than anything happening in the divorce proceedings. They moved into a townhouse in Del Rey, 15 minutes from my office, and I found myself at their kitchen table most Sunday evenings, the way I used to be at Camille's kitchen table when Brielle was a girl doing her math homework. Brielle finished her master's degree in public policy that spring, and took a position with a nonprofit focused on housing equity in Northern Virginia, work I was, and remain, deeply proud of. When she got pregnant the following year, she called me before she called anyone else, the same way she had with the engagement, and when her daughter was born in late autumn, she and Theo named her Eleanor Whitfield Whitlock. My name woven permanently into the next generation of a family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with who actually shows up. I held Eleanor in the hospital room 2 hours after she was born, this impossibly small person who would never know a version of her family where I wasn't simply, unquestionably, her grandfather. Camille was not in that hospital room. She had asked to come, Brielle told me later, gently, the way she tells me difficult things now, and Brielle had told her mother she needed time, that the wedding and everything after it had changed something between them that wasn't ready to be repaired yet. I didn't ask Brielle to make that choice. I want to be very clear about that. I never once told my stepdaughter to choose a side. She made that decision entirely on her own, looking at the evidence of who had actually shown up for her, year after year, the way I'd learned, a long time ago in my own career, that people eventually do. It's been almost 2 years now since that day in Middleburg, since I stood at the entrance to a tent full of white roses, and was told there must be a mistake. I've thought about that phrase more times than I can count since then. There must be a mistake. Camille was right, in a sense, though not in the way she meant it. There was a mistake that day. It just wasn't mine. The mistake was thinking that 19 years of patience and steadiness in a man could be mistaken for 19 years of having no spine at all. The mistake was assuming that a man who spends his career structuring the consequences of broken trust for other families would simply absorb it when his own trust was broken, with an audience of 200 people watching, no less. I still practice estate law in Alexandria. I still help families decide who gets what, who gets remembered and who gets quietly written out when the people in them are gone. I think about my own family differently now than I did before that wedding day, less in terms of who shares my blood and more in terms of who actually shows up, year after year, in the unglamorous, unrecorded moments that nobody puts on a seating chart. Brielle calls me every Sunday now just to talk, the way she used to call about her math homework. Eleanor is almost a year old and has started saying something that sounds, if you squint, like pop, which is what Theo and Brielle decided I should be called. A small, deliberate gift they didn't have to give me but did anyway. I don't know what happened to Camille's business in the long run, not fully. I heard secondhand that Callaway Interiors survived the restructuring, smaller now, with a different name on half the equity, but still operating. I wish her, genuinely, no further harm. I'm not in the business of revenge for its own sake. I never was. I was in the business of consequences, of making sure that the structures I'd spent a lifetime building actually meant something when they were finally tested. What I learned, in the months after that wedding, is that you can love someone for 19 years and still be a stranger to what they'll do when they think no one's watching closely enough to notice. And you can also discover, in the wreckage of that, who actually was watching all along, who actually chose you, over and over, in all the small ways that don't get photographed for a magazine feature, but matter infinitely more than any of it. Hey, real quick before you go, I want to say something about this one. The part that got me writing this story wasn't the wedding. It wasn't even the money. It was how long Whitfield stayed quiet while all those small signs kept stacking up. The missing tasting, the seating chart, the rehearsal dinner he wasn't invited to. We all do that. We notice something's off and we talk ourselves out of it because the alternative is too painful to sit with. And honestly, I don't think staying calm in that moment makes you weak. I think it makes you dangerous in the best way, because you're not reacting, you're paying attention. So if you've got a gut feeling about someone right now that you keep explaining away, maybe trust it a little more. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a moment like that. And if you're new here, subscribe, because we tell stories like this every single week.